to start the recording now. And I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. I'm joined by my friends and team members, Chris Cosper and Cathy McCullough. Chris is our head of coaching at Rhythm Systems. She works hard to coach our team of coaches and also coaches our clients to achieve breakthrough execution and success with rhythm. Cathy McCullough is a business growth coach in our village of coaches, and she works with organizations to develop their strategic intent and has specific expertise in the realm of people issues and high performance leadership. Chris and Cathy, it's great to be here with you today.
Thanks, Ryan. We're happy to be here. I know Cathy and I have had a great time getting ready for this webcast, and we're happy to be on the live session now and able to speak with clients and other companies out there that might be able to use a little help in getting ready for their annual planning session. So the question we want to answer is, what's keeping you from having a great annual planning session? You know, every year we facilitate a lot of planning sessions. All of our coaches do. And for some, you know, we've been a part of the client's planning rhythm for years and years, and for others this will be the first time. So the one thing that we know for sure is that no two annual planning sessions are ever the same. Every client brings different challenges, a different dynamic to the session, and even those that we've been planning with for 6 or 7 years, they bring something new to the table every single year. Annual planning is a really important part of your Think, Plan, Do rhythm. We know that based on Patrick Tien's book, Rhythm, that there are 3 keys to breakthrough execution. There's a think rhythm, a plan rhythm, and a do rhythm. So today we're going to focus on the importance of your plan rhythm. And you know, this is a really key piece, this annual planning, in connecting your strategy to execution. And it also serves as an anchor for every single one of your quarterly plans. So the importance of getting this right, you just can't underestimate that. Now, everyone who signed up for today's webcast should have received a link to download a copy of our annual planning guide. This is our gift to you. And if you didn't receive that, you can find this guide in our resource center. And then, as Ryan said earlier, he has posted the link also in the chat section for you. If you've had a chance to read it, you know that there really is a method to our madness. There's a step-by-step process that we follow, and we recommend that you do the same. But there's also sort of an additional step that we take as coaches that's not mentioned in this guide, and that's what we wanted to talk to you about today. We believe that all the information that's in this guide is critical to creating a winning annual plan, but we also believe that these are sort of table stakes. So for our purposes today, we're going to assume that you all understand the basic components of this annual planning guide and that you don't really have questions about what's in the guide. But let me also tell you that if you do have questions, it's okay. We have another resource for you. It's a link that you can find in our resource center on our website, and it will be a link to a previous webcast that we did that is a little bit more of the basics of annual planning. So if you find yourself wanting to know more information about basic annual planning, then please check that out in our resource center. So we know that many of our clients are larger. They're more complex companies. They have a unique set of challenges. In fact, we like to refer to our core customers as the elite 2%. And the reason that we say this, when we say this, we're referring to some statistics that have been provided by the U.S. Census. And those statistics show that only 2% of companies ever reach the $10 million mark. And that's a significant mark, and of course many of our clients go well beyond that 10 million mark, but just getting to the 10 million mark is a big deal. That puts you in the elite 2%. And once that happens, we find that these companies, they have multiple departments, multiple locations, divisions, they have layers that they have to cascade to. There's just a whole new set of challenges that are involved. And a simplistic step-by-step approach many times just doesn't work for them anymore. And it's because of the complexity of these companies that we find that there's almost always a need to customize the approach. And the final agenda that's used for these companies' planning sessions is almost never exactly the same as the one we start with. At Rhythm Systems, we're just really big fans of Covey, and we believe that it's always important to begin with the end in mind. And so when we think about annual planning, we're always focused on this end result. We know that the common goal for all annual planning sessions is a team aligned around a handful of priorities that, once completed, will move the company closer to achieving its long-term goals. So what we have found is that the number one mistake that CEOs make is that they really fail to think deeper about the underlying issues and challenges that could sabotage the process. So we're all focused on that, the common goal of putting together a great plan, but it really takes this additional step of thinking beyond the obvious and the stuff that's on the surface, and thinking below the surface about what could get in the way. And we have kind of developed a process for breaking through that barrier with our clients. And the way that we're able to get our clients to dig deep and anticipate these things is really very simple. We ask them one question, and it always leads to a very candid conversation between the coach and the CEO. At Rhythm Systems, we call this the super green call. And if you're familiar with us at all, you know that for every priority, every KPI, every client engagement, everything we do, we want to be very clear about what success looks like. So we apply the red, yellow, green success criteria basically to everything we do. And if you work with us, you know the power of setting the super green stretch goal. So that's what we're looking for when we ask this question. What would make this a super green session for you? So if the green goal is really an annual planning session that leads to a team that's aligned around a handful of priorities, then the super green goal is what really makes every annual planning session special and unique. The question our coaches ask, what would make this a super green session for you, is an open-ended question that holds a lot of power. And of course, it's a simple question, and we usually get a simple answer to start with, but the simple answer is just the tip of the iceberg. The real answer lies in the conversation that follows, and that's the conversation that uncovers, why this hasn't been happening in the past. Why have the previous planning sessions not really produced a great plan? And it's the conversation that reveals the barriers and the roadblocks that are below the surface. It's the conversation that usually doesn't take place if you're not using an outside facilitator. People don't have these conversations with themselves normally. So it's a very intentional step that you have to take. And the answer is different for every client's every session. This is where the coach really gets the information needed to design the agenda and the pre-work, ensuring that the team is able to accomplish not only the green goal of preparing a great plan for the next 12 months, but also the super green goal, the one that allows them to break through the barriers. So here are some common examples of comments that we hear when we ask this question. Folks will say things like, we really need to bring the executive team together this time. And we need to create alignment across departments, get rid of our silos. We want people to challenge the status quo, not sure that people are really saying what they think in these planning sessions. Or there's an elephant or a sacred cow in the room and nobody wants to talk about it. They'll say things like, I just don't think my team knows how to work together very well. We've got some team dynamics that aren't healthy. Or we have a difficult player on our executive team. And then, many times we'll hear just, they don't know exactly what it is. They can't put their finger on it. But they say, we're great at planning, but we never execute the plan. We need to create sort of a new level of commitment to how we execute our plan. So, this is just like a handful of things that we hear, but as we listen to it over and over with so many sessions and so many coaches working and we're collaborating together, we're able to put together the patterns of what these things really fall into and what people are actually saying when they say these things. So we've identified the top 3 reasons that sessions will get off track. The first one is that there are unaddressed people challenges. 90% of the time there's people challenges that haven't been identified yet, or they've been identified and just not dealt with. And these are usually things like unclear roles, or unsure of each other's motives, or conflicting motives maybe. Could be a difficult team member, some lack of accountability or trust issues. Those are all different types of things that fall into this pattern. The second one is that there are significant or hidden barriers. And these are things that may not be obvious, but must be dealt with. Things like a complicated organizational structure or some ceiling of complexity that's been hit. When you hear things like what used to work in the past just isn't working anymore, there's a lack of adherence to systems and processes. We find that this is where people start working outside the system to get things done. So the way that they used to do it, it's just getting in the way. So it's not that anyone is intentionally doing things wrong or trying to be difficult. It's just that things have changed below the surface and no one has had time to deal with it yet. So that's the second pattern. And the third thing that we find is this idea of the elephant in the room. Something's going on that's just a little bit uncomfortable and nobody wants to talk about it. And until this is addressed, your ability to create a successful plan is truly limited. And it's hard to bring this out for yourself. Like if you're facilitating your own session or you're meeting with the same people over and over again, it sort of becomes a habit to ignore it. So a lot of times it takes a catalyst and someone in the room that can call it out and put it on the table and deal with it in a non-emotional way. You have to be on the lookout for all three of these things, and you have to be willing to dig deep to see what might be standing between you and a great annual plan. So today, what we're going to do, Cathy and I are going to share a few real-life examples of how we and some of our coaches have been able to help companies address these barriers and determine what it was that they needed to do to break through as they grew and became more complex. One thing we've learned is that annual planning really isn't just about determining your priorities. It's about breaking through those barriers that are inhibiting you from growing. So Cathy, I'm going to ask you to join us now, and maybe you can kick us off by sharing this first company story with us.
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah, this is a great case study about what we're talking about relative to those three barriers, because it really hits all three of them, but specifically probably the significant barriers, and those were also the elephant. Those things were also formed the elephant in the room. This was a new company, or a company under new ownership. So you had a blended executive team. Some were with the company as it had been, and now you have a few new people brought in by the new CEO. So you had a blend of team members. So it was a new day at this organization, and definitely change was coming. They'd been working together for a few months, and the CEO just felt like, we have some things that we need to talk through because some things aren't going as smoothly as we might like.
Cathy, Patrick says to us all the time that when you bring one new member onto a team, you've really created a new team.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the dynamics shift a little bit until everything kind of evens out. So,
Yeah.
and that was kind of the situation here. And the CEO really was, he's run companies before. He knows the relevance of getting them, of everybody thinking at a strategic level, but also thinking in alignment.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a pre-call, both with the CEO and the COO, and what was pulled out from that call was that they really needed a stronger set of communication pathways, especially starting at this E-team level. So he wanted to maximize the results achieved during the actual session itself, because otherwise, he said, we really are going to be very limited in how we actually get around to executing our plan if we don't work through some things in the process. So it was his thinking, and I agreed, that without alignment in thinking, their strategic intent would be sabotaged as they would begin to execute on that plan for the upcoming year. So as a result of the call that we had, we adapted the typical annual planning on-site to include kind of some other elements, 4 specific ones that were incorporated into the standard agenda. So we adapted it, number one, and just to figure out how are we going to operate as a team versus in a vacuum, or versus all of us kind of trying to control things because we just don't know what's happening, or how do we get clarity around operating as a team? So that was one thing we discussed in this particular annual planning session. Secondly, we just needed to get something around the acknowledgement that we were all working toward the same goals and that everybody played a part in the overall execution of those goals, but really getting clear on what the success metrics were and who was doing what, which leads to the third thing. We had to have a conversation, a fairly pointed one, around the new roles and responsibilities um, moving forward, because there had been some challenges there. So just needed a facilitated discussion around what that clarity looked like around roles and responsibilities. And finally, number 4, just ending with an agreement on the systems and processes that would be used from that point forward, like decision making, new technology processes. In other words, the new team was wanting to upgrade the IT infrastructure. There were those in the room that didn't think that was necessary. So just getting clarity around that particular path of progress around what's going to make this a stronger company.
So Cathy, how did you adapt the agenda to be able to cover all that? Because that is sort of outside the realm of the basic steps in the agenda.
Right. Well, as you can see on the screen, how do you eat an elephant? The answer is one bite at a time.
Yeah.
So the first thing I like to clarify for anyone is that you can't do it all. I mean, you have a plan, a one-page plan, and not to worry about filling in every box. What's important is that you identify what's relevant now and what are going to be the long-term success indicators for us as an organization. Where do we need to spend our time, in addition to setting, obviously, the goals and the priorities. So we spent a lot of time around creating their new corporate foundation. What are the 4 to 6 guiding principles, also known as core values? What are those? What do those look like now? And let's gain agreement around that. So we co-created those relative to the thinking in the room. Next, we spent some time around, okay, it's a new day here, so let's just go 10 years out. Let's not go 25, 50 years out. Let's just go 10 years out. You know, what's our BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal? What's our vision? What do we want to be known for? What are we going to be building toward? So we spent a great deal of time just solidifying the foundation of their organization and talking about how to use those concepts in day-to-day interactions, even with each other, around building sets of accountabilities. So we really took a deep dive there. Mm-hmm. We also then incorporated time around understanding, that was real important to the CEO, that people in the room understand that there's a difference between management and leadership. So he said, I really want us just to kind of review some of the basic principles behind running a great and a strong organization. So we spent a little bit of time there. And then, of course, the annual planning session, annual plan itself. And we ended it with a healthy discussion around role clarification. Who's doing what? What are the changes and adaptations to the org chart? Mm-hmm. Expectations around the meeting rhythm and things like that. So we really kind of set a great stage, hopefully, for them to move forward.
Yeah. So what happened after the session?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. It was a really great session, and I like clients to tell me it was great. So their feedback was, wow. I mean, they loved the richness of the discussion. The specific words were, we are so excited. Another one was that we're a little bit tired after that session because of all the strategic thinking we had to do. And some of the tough discussions, I think, but they said it was a good tired, that it actually felt good to have that much clarity. Mm-hmm. So they also felt finally that they were closer to setting the stage toward excellence, and for just, it's a new day here, and now we feel good about that. So I think they felt they were in a better place than they were when they actually came into the session.
So they're starting to create this together now for the first time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the CEO felt that as well. He said, this on-site, in his mind, it allowed him to fully participate in the process. I encouraged him, since it was a facilitated session, to join in. Now, there are certain times when I really wanted him to speak last, mm-hmm. but I also wanted him in the meantime to be observing what people said, and just so he could learn where their thinking was, because that gives him good information for how to coach individual team players toward their own higher levels of success. So he spent some time doing that too. He really liked talking about the elephant in the room as well. He thought that was one of the most valuable things they did, that he said, I'm just not sure we could have done it, or would have been willing to have the discussion to the degree that we did. So,
Great. So let me ask this way. What are some key takeaways that you would recommend to any of our listeners today who might recognize some of their story in this story? It may not be exactly the same, but they hear some things that sound familiar.
Absolutely. I think some of the key actions are that you can actually take away to act upon is to make sure you do have a core foundation. What are the core values of the organization? And I even sometimes like to go in and have the people in the room, sometimes I'll do this as pre-work, is to rank on a scale of 1 to 5 the degree to which each person feels we're living those core values, because that can then frame a great discussion around where are we doing well at that and where are we not and why. And are they even core values anymore, or are they just a list of words on a chart? And core purpose, and in this case, though, we spent more time on the core values and the BHAG. Secondly would be clarification around roles and responsibilities. A lot of people struggle with this, and it's with good intent. We're all trying to do a great job, but we get in each other's swim lanes, so to speak, and that causes a lot of distrust, or it can cause somebody to feel like you're moving into my territory. What are you doing? So we talk a lot about how to manage that process, but also let's get specific first. Who is doing what? Thirdly, do what you can to identify and then have a healthy discussion around the elephant in the room. And finally, setting some ground rules for moving forward. We did that with this team. Now, they have core values, which should, of course, guide everything, but it sometimes helps to have a subset. You know, just when we get together as an executive team, we're going to have some discussions. What are some ground rules for us so that we can have those healthy discussions?
I've heard those called operating principles sometimes.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So, and I think just not to confuse those with the core values, to make sure they're just ground rules we've agreed on. And they usually do bubble up to support the core values as well. So in this particular case, the elephant in the room was discussed, and it was discussed by older team members who were struggling with some of the new decisions that had been made, by newer team members that really were new to everything and they weren't sure what to do, and the specific or the hidden barriers that were uncovered, which was that nobody knew what the company was all about, where they were headed, what they were trying to accomplish. So definitely at the end of the 2-day session, the entire team was in a very different place for the better.
That's great. Great story. So Ryan, you want to check in for us and see if we have any questions?
Yeah, we do have some questions. Got several good questions that have come in. Cassidy is asking, were there any naysayers during the discussion? And if there were, how did you handle those folks?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think that you'll always find that. You'll even find that as a hidden barrier sometimes, that people are what I call hood ornaments. They're sitting there shaking their head like they agree, but that's the first time you've ever seen that agreement. So how to handle that is pretty much just to honor where they are, because this is not a discussion about who's right and who's wrong. It's a discussion about clarity, and realizing that consensus doesn't mean everybody agrees. Consensus means we might, I, the naysayer, might disagree, but I have to agree leaving the room that I can support what we've collectively decided. And so that's usually the waters that we navigate when that happens.
Yeah. And Cathy, I've also seen it become real important sometimes to just describe what support looks like. So to be real clear about saying we all agree that we will support this plan, and support means that when we leave this room, we'll all speak positively about the plan. No one will say they decided, it's we decided, and that we will all be committed to doing everything we can to make sure this is successful. That's what support looks like.
That's really good. And just to add one more point of just something you can do is to ask each team member to share what is one thing they need from their peer group.
Good.
Thanks, Cathy. That's a great expression, hood ornament. I'll have to be careful not to ever be known as a hood ornament. I'll remember that one as a takeaway. I got another question here from Philip. He's asking, what happens if the elephant in the room relates to something very sensitive that wouldn't be appropriate to discuss as a group? For example, pay or CEO leadership style, etc.
That's another great question. And I do think that certain things are not conducive to team discussion. Some things are, but in fact, in September, I just came from an executive retreat where that was the situation. And I usually just say, and it came through in the pre-work that I had collected from the team ahead of time. So I just shared the collective pre-work, and I shared it one-on-one with the CEO. Relative to this is something that's not appropriate because it's pretty much about just one or two people, and it's really an issue that's not a team issue. So they were willing to handle that, which they did, and are in the process of. But yet every voice has to know they were heard, because when it's that strong, it's coming through that strongly that we have an issue and we can't work with this particular person or whatever, the voice needs to be heard. So collectively, it was put up on the screen as, this is some data, but no names are used. It's just really more of, this is something and that we've talked about and shared, and you should see some movement on this within your organization, and etc. So some things are not conducive to talk about in a team session.
But it sounds like the two key things that you're saying is that, one, it should still be addressed with the individuals that are most closely related to it,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and two, the person that was brave enough to bring it up needs some confirmation that it's been heard and is being addressed.
Well, and usually it's not a person. Usually I look at the collective data ahead of time and what bubbles to the top. If it's a one-time mention, I question if it's really just something they're hung up on. But if it bubbles up consistently, we have inaccuracies in our pay system, or we've got a trouble with one or two team members. If it's fairly consistent in the pre-work, then it is something that they need to know their voice was heard, and then share it with the CEO.
I have another question from Jessica. Identifying the elephant in the room is usually pretty tough to do. So she's asking, what questions do you ask to do that? How do you ask those questions to identify the elephant in the room?
That's a good one. I just ask the question. I do it in the pre-work, and remember, it is confidential, so I don't share who shared what elephant or anything else. And it's amazing the alignment that comes through. I share it, like I said, no names are used or whatever. I collect it all and put it up on the screen relative to what bubbles up. So I just ask, what's the elephant in the room?
So that's one of the questions that you include on the pre-work that you send out to clients.
Exactly, yeah. And I'll see some things come through as well. Like I always leave room for miscellaneous comments, and there's some other things that, like, what's not going so well is another question I ask, but it's amazing how those usually align. But I just specifically ask, what is the elephant in the room?
Okay, and finally on this segment, Cindy's asking, if you have to have one of those elephant in the room discussions, then how much time do you allocate for that discussion, and what do you have to remove from the standard agenda to include that discussion?
Always customize the agenda relative to the pre-call with the CEO, and sometimes that also includes a COO or another key partner. But I customize that based on that discussion, and we talk about, here are the things we're going to have to take out of this discussion because we can't do it all, and nor should we. I don't think the goal should be, like I said earlier, to fill in every little box or square. But you have to have the right discussions because they are hidden barriers that are keeping you from reaching higher levels of success. You cannot be a high-performance organization if you aren't willing to address certain key issues. So it depends on what the elephant is relative to how much time we give to it. In the session I just shared, we spent a great deal of time on just the core values piece, because they also had to understand how you use those pieces. So just developing what those core values were and the vision statement. So we spent time on that. If you can't give it the time it needs to have a facilitated discussion, then my recommendation is don't have the discussion, because you limit your ability to come to fruition with something that's really going to be meaningful. So we shift the agenda around together.
Kathy, I was going to say too that the agenda is usually set, like if you think about the 5 steps in the annual planning guide, the first step is sort of understanding your current environment. So there are many things on the agenda that help you do that. One is reviewing the prior year, talking about victories, but also talking about lessons learned. That a lot of times the elephant may live there in that section.
Absolutely.
Another thing is the start, stop, keep exercise and the review of that. You may find that that's where the elephant lives. So it's usually that, it's not so much that you have to set aside time in the agenda specifically for elephants. It's just knowing where the elephant is and knowing that that's where you're probably going to spend a little bit extra time.
Absolutely. That's another, absolutely.
Well, I've got one more question from Joan. Joan is asking, is it best for the CEO to facilitate the annual planning session or someone else on the team?
Depends on if the CEO is the elephant in the room.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah. Oh,
well, we find over and over that CEOs really, we have a lot of client CEOs that are great facilitators, and it's a skill and a talent that they naturally have, and they do a fantastic job. Sometimes it's difficult for anyone on the team to facilitate a sensitive discussion about things that have been lying under the surface for some period of time. So, especially if there's a sensitive issue that needs to be addressed, then it's probably best for the CEO not to be the one facilitating. We do find, though, that even with very healthy situations where there is no elephant, the CEO often can bring more value when they're allowed to strictly participate and not be responsible for facilitation, because that is a big responsibility. And it may be that you want to bring in someone from the outside, or you may have someone on your team that's a really strong facilitator that's, not the leader of the team, but is on the team or in the company and can come in and play that role for you. So I would really base that on the CEO's skills and the level of involvement that you want to have.
Yeah, and I just one of the retreats that I just did in September, the CEO actually told me afterwards, I had no idea how much time I was spending preparing, because he really wanted to have a good session, preparing to do that. And he said, I got so much more out of it spending my time elsewhere where the company needed me and letting you come in and do this. And so, I think that's something just for every CEO to figure out what is the best use of his or her time, and just to look at it that way. And then ask a few questions, can I lead that? Will the discussion be the same? And most executives tell me probably not. They'll have some good discussions, but it's never the same as when you have an outside facilitator in the room. So that's another thing I hear a lot too.
Okay, well let's keep moving along.
Yeah, well, to build on that, Chris, I know you've worked with a really large corporation, I think fairly recently, then they had a lot of major divisions. So parts of that story I think were really intriguing as you were sharing it with me. So I thought it might be of interest to our listeners as well.
Yeah, so this particular client was dealing with a situation that we are coming across more and more often, especially with larger companies. It's a large company, several major divisions. The company had worked very hard over the past few years to develop the divisions, and they were being very successful in each one. Each one had its own unique product offering, a separate list of key customers, its own leadership team. They were really trying to operate as standalone businesses and doing quite well with that. But they all shared the same corporate support. So things like finance and HR and production, these were all shared services. And each of these divisions had to rely on these shared services in order to be able to fulfill their plans. So they'd been doing a great job of planning at the division level, but the problem they were running into was daily competition for those shared resources. Each division had a very clear set of priorities, but when resources were scarce, and resources are always scarce in every company of every size, it's really impossible to prioritize within the functional groups what needed to be done first, because everything was most important to somebody. So in this situation, it became clear during our Super Green call, the main thing the CEO said she wanted to accomplish was to have sort of a standardized structure and process for aligning these divisions and prioritizing work and running the daily operation. She really wanted to see the impact after the session on how the divisions interacted with each other and how the company was able to communicate and prioritize things. So we talked about the fact that there really was one overall corporate strategy. I mean, there was one company. There was one BHAG, one set of long-term goals that they were all trying to achieve. And the role of the business divisions was to create market strategies and to generate revenue to achieve these goals.
Okay, so that sounds that's a nice monster. So how did you structure that planning session?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people call this a matrix organization, and so that's sort of what we were dealing with. But during the conversation, what we realized had been missing was the company level planning. Again, great job at the division level planning, but the overall company level planning had been lacking. So we needed to create an overall plan for the company for the year and for the quarter, and that had to be done before the division level planning could be done, so that the divisions could understand their role in supporting the company's plan. So the traditional cascading model that we use, it does that. It creates the company plan first, and then it cascades down, usually into functional teams like finance. The finance team will do their plan, the sales team will do their plan, the operations team will do their plan. But in this case, the teams weren't functional, or they weren't dysfunctional, but they weren't based on the function in the business. They were, they were business divisions, and each one was made up of cross-functional teams. So we decided to use the same process, but to modify it to fit their structure. So the one thing that we really wanted to watch out for was we didn't want to lose the value of being able to get information and input from the divisions during the company level planning session, right? So further down in the organization, we knew that that's where the people were closest to the customers, and they were the ones who would have the most knowledge about current opportunities and the timing of things and insights about what was going on. So we had to be very careful, if we were trying to raise the level of planning up to the company level, not to do it in a way that diminished the amount of input from those closest to the customer. So we included the cross-functional division teams in the pre-work portion of the planning session. We asked each division leader to get together with their teams prior to the session to review the ending quarter, discuss the opportunities and threats that were within view, and to do the start, stop, keep exercise. And then once we got into the planning sessions, we were able to have all that information available. We started by reviewing some of the core foundational pieces of the company's long-term strategy. We worked on, again, we had the information from lower down, but we were raising the thinking up to the corporate level. So we started with things like the core purpose, the core values, and the BHAG. Again, just to make sure everyone, no matter which division they were in, were clear that they were all moving toward this common goal.
Right, and they may not have really looked at those in a while, or so. It's just it's good as a refresher. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We talked about the 3 to 5 year financial targets and determined where as a company they needed to be, and then we're able to kind of negotiate and portion out, what portion of that target would be fulfilled by each one of the divisions, what the contribution needed to be in order to make it work. We also talked about the overall winning moves to drive growth in the company, and again, how to align the divisions, so that they were, working on things at the same time, that they could have some synergy around and bring the resources together to work toward one goal. And that was going to be a very powerful thing for them going forward. But then they were also able, after determining what the winning moves were, to talk about what additional infrastructure they would need and what additional shared resources would be required in order to support that growth.
Right. So So as you went about, I'm assuming that they left with a much higher level of alignment, at least feeling like they were aligned. So what was the result? What did they share relative to feeling that stronger sense of alignment?
Yeah, well, in this case, the barrier we broke through wasn't so much a hidden barrier, but it certainly was a significant one. It was, it was just getting it's a monster when you're dealing with these matrix organizations to try to figure out what the order and timing and sequencing of planning should be. So the barrier was caused by this complex matrix structure and the lack of alignment around the unifying company plan. The main result that we saw after the planning session was that, not only did they come out with a good plan, but they were able to really change the way they approached planning in general going forward. And they also changed the way they communicated with each other and worked together across divisions on a daily basis. So their meeting structure changed. They have daily huddles with cross-functional teams, and then they have the weekly meetings within the divisions, and then at the company level also. So there's a lot of cascading. The information's flowing across the matrix and up and down in the matrix.
Okay, so if you were to just summarize that relative to key takeaways for our listeners, what might be those takeaways for things that they can act on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the first thing that I think was so important that we did here was the engaging the second tier divisions in the planning process through pre-work. So being able to gather information and collect data and have all of that available as you're making decisions, that's, I would definitely recommend that. Second, build the company level plan first. There's always debate about which is the right way to do it, but over and over again we find that if you want to unify your divisions, mm-hmm. then they've got to know where they're going together, and then they can get very specific about what they'll be doing that's different from each other. But first, let's focus on what we have in common. And then let the divisions build their plans in support of the company plan. And a real important piece here is that, and then share those plans with each other so that each division knows what the other is doing.
Yeah, that step sometimes is left out, I think, mm-hmm. that we don't communicate, you don't cross-communicate. So it's very difficult to see how it all comes together for the common good, so to speak, of the overall company.
Yeah. So Ryan, you want to check in with us, and have we gotten any questions?
Yeah, we've got we've got a couple of questions here, and while we're answering these, if you have other questions, you can go ahead and type those in now. Jennifer's asking, what specific pre-work will best engage our second-tier groups in the annual planning process?
Well, I think it's really important so this is to engage the second-tier groups, to allow them to reflect on the work that's been done. To come together and review the prior year and the prior quarter and ask those questions together collectively. Where were we successful? What victories did we have? What new foundation are we working from that is a result of the work that we've done this past year that allows us to go even further in the next year? And then the start, stop, keep exercise is great. It's a great way to get sort of that top of mind information from everybody in the organization. You can do that, even beyond the second tier in an organization. And the more information you get, the better.
And to add to that, I think it's beneficial. Sometimes I'll suggest that companies ask, especially the layers that down the way a little bit, what's one question you have for the CEO?
Oh, I love that question. Yeah.
Yeah, so sometimes that can help people feel like, it's a direct question, and then you kind of know what they need to hear. So sometimes that helps as well.
Thanks. And we got another question. It's more around culture of planning. It's a large organization. So John's asking, we've got a large organization. We have this culture of divisional planning, then coming to an annual planning session and presenting our plan to the team, rather than the scenario you just talked about of collaborative planning. How do you change that culture and that spirit within a large organization?
So the culture, the culture really, the big change is from planning in silos to collaborative planning. And thinking in terms of building a culture of collaboration can be a really important thing. And people, there's just a much higher level of commitment to a plan when a team feels like they've had a part in the creation of that plan. So if the culture has been that the plan is created and then it is presented, and 90% of the people in the company are just given the plan, there'll be a lot of questions. There'll be a lot of people who really don't understand why things are the way they are. They just don't have the benefit of all the conversation that the team who created the plan has had in of understanding the conversations and decisions that have been made that created that plan. So, to change your culture from one of plan and present to collaborate and plan is really what you have to do. And again, I think you'll see the level of commitment to the execution of the plan much higher if you're able to do this.
And do you see that sometimes, leaders will come in a room and they really have some great ideas, but they don't necessarily know the specifics of how to get there?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, garnering the collective intelligence of the people in the room and looking at that as a valued asset to the organization is one way to do what you're suggesting relative to increasing collaboration.
Yeah. All right. Well, Cathy, I know you have another story to share. I'm watching our clock, so I want to be conscious of the time.
Okay.
You want to share, I think it was one about a company that was doing a lot of things right?
Yes.
And growing, doing
yes.
well, but still found it difficult to plan.
Oh yeah, they were. Yeah, this is a great case study, and it's a good example of people issues. That was also the elephant in the room. That's many times the case. But this was a strong, healthy company. They had hit a ceiling of complexity, though, because they were continuing to grow. Things were snowballing, so that's a nice problem to have on one hand. But because of that, the company was changing and roles were expanding. So they had grown very organically at a healthy rate, but when they hit this certain ceiling of complexity, things were starting to feel different. And the CEO and some of the E-team members collectively kind of they could feel that happening. And some team members were, as a result of this growth, needing to shed opportunities and delegate to others. Some of them needed to begin focusing more on where their expertise was to begin with, and so hiring in a new teammate at the executive level to kind of take over those responsibilities that were being shed. Another challenge that they were having was the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And this particular CEO had a strong belief in individual and team development. And they were using a lot of Lencioni's work, so we modified that into the session as well.
So what did you do? How did you do that? What did the session look like?
Okay, well, the session, I asked him ahead of time, of course, what is it that you want to accomplish? What would make this a super green session for you? And he just identified his own recognition that the company simply could not keep operating just kind of the way it was without a stronger sense of order. What worked when they were much smaller wasn't going to work anymore. So he wanted to do that as well, and he also said he wanted to follow it with use of the rhythm dashboard to kind of keep control of that complexity. Secondly, he wanted his team members to become more disciplined in their approach, which is a lot of what they had been reading in Lencioni's work. So we just needed to look at how does that really play out as we manage and guide ourselves through this particular transition of going from a smaller company to a much larger company. Thirdly, he wanted his team to understand the value of strategic thinking versus merely going through the motions. He said, I do not want to be great planners. I want us to be great planners that can leave a room and execute. And so we really looked at how to identify specific key success metrics for each goal that would be prioritized in their annual plan for the upcoming year.
So you used red, yellow, green for those?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
So the onsite itself was an annual planning session, but incorporated into that was just some of the foundational work that they had done already. It was very good, very well intentioned, but they needed to streamline it together. We talked earlier about core values and then having some of those ground rules. They had several sets of those, so we just needed to say which of all these sets that you have is your core. And that was really a great discussion to have with them. The next thing that we took time to do collectively was to just talk about, I just asked them the question, who have you become? And do you even like who you've become? And what are some of the barriers to our own success that we already see? So we had a great discussion around that relative to the Think, Plan, Do model and how using that would for a stronger sense of ease and simplicity on the execution side would really help them.
I see, yeah. And so what were the results?
Well, oh yeah, that particular, they did use the Rhythm dashboard, and they still do. So it's a great continuing client, which has given them a much easier way to kind of keep on the radar. What are we doing? Where are we getting off track? So every quarter is that 13-week race, and they don't get blindsided at the end of a quarter or two, or at the end of a year with what didn't go well. So they have a much stronger foundation, according to their follow-up information to me, on focus and clarity. They've really consistently been able to move the needle, and so they can feel forward movement, which was getting very lost as they hit the ceiling of complexity. Yeah, and the CEO really also said to me later that he really appreciated being the active participant, because that allowed him time to do that versus facilitating it himself, or even having another team member facilitate. He said, I really want everybody to be able to be there and fully engaged. And finally, I think he made an interesting observation that some portions of the discussion just probably wouldn't have happened, or they would have been different and not as deep and meaningful or heartfelt, had he not asked an outside facilitator to come in. So he was really amazed at the level of discussion. And then he laughingly said that he must not be as good of a facilitator as he thought he was, which I told him, no.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So what are some key takeaways that you would recommend to someone, getting ready for their session, that they think about going into it?
Okay, so I think, as I think about this one, they were at their own place, much like the first company I talked about, and a little bit of like the one you shared. They had to establish a new normal. Now, it was for a different reason. It was because they were continuing to grow, but it wasn't going to look, the company wasn't going to look the same as it always had. So they had to acknowledge what was and what is. And we had to look at that. And so I think that's a key takeaway that I would share with our listeners, is to make sure that you try to establish, there is a difference in what was and what is. Secondly, to determine just the new rhythm, a new working rhythm, and the new habits that everyone will have to commit to going forward, so they can run the business versus the business running them. Yeah. Thirdly would be to make a long-term vision, and to make sure everybody is clear around that big, hairy, audacious goal, ever how you decided to define long-term. Fourth is to take time to discuss, which we did in this session, about how to lead people through change, because everybody in this room is having to turn around and lead people through this organization looking different. So how do you do that? So we actually spent a little bit of time. So I would suggest that to our listeners as well. Next, to state specific accountabilities around metrics, as well as who's doing what, which leads to the final point, which is to just have a forthright discussion about role clarity and how the org chart needs to shift. What are one or two new key hires we need to make when the time is right? So what does that mean for the people in this room? Who's going to be shedding and who's not?
Great. Gosh, that sounds so helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Brian, any questions on this one?
Well, we didn't have any questions come in from that segment, and that's good because we had so many earlier in the webinar that we're kind of hitting our time window here. So I think we can go ahead and move on to closing things out.
All right, great. Well, as you can see with these examples, growing a company really is complicated. And in every case, we were able to produce a great annual plan, but we were also able to achieve so much more. And understanding and looking for these things, and then putting a plan together to be able to deal with those unaddressed people changes, significant or hidden barriers, or the elephant in the room, is so key. If your company is growing and reaching a ceiling of complexity, or if you're wondering why you've never been able to fully execute your plan, be willing to dig deep and ask yourself, what are some of the underlying issues and challenges that could be sabotaging our planning process? And so we want to invite you now to visit our resource center at rhythmsystems.com. If you go to the website, you'll see a tab that says Resource Center, and there is a lot of great helpful information there for you. And of course, our Village of Coaches would be happy to work with you if you'd like someone to work one-on-one with your company. Ryan?
All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris and Cathy, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, if you need help with the basics of annual planning and the specific tools for pre-work and facilitation that Chris and Cathy mentioned in the webinar, just please go to rhythmsystems.com. You'll find all those resources there. This concludes our webcast for the day. Please help us by taking just 1 minute to give us some feedback at the end of the webcast. There'll be a survey that pops up. We'd really love to hear your feedback so that we can continue to improve these webcasts for you. Again, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.